I'm Ben Weingarten, and this is the Weingarten Report, the show where we bring you the most critical stories and compelling arguments and analyses on the most vital issues of our time. The Weingarten Report is brought to you by AMAC. In this week's episode, the method to the Biden administration's Middle East madness. Let's roll the tapes.
I haven't seen any evidence in either cases that domestic courts both can and will prosecute alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I would emphasize that in Israel and Palestine, this includes crimes committed by both the Israeli security forces and Hamas. In Afghanistan, it includes crimes committed by the Afghan national government and the Taliban. So in both of these cases, if domestic courts can't or won't pursue justice, and we oppose the ICC, where do we think the victims of these supposed crimes can go for justice? In both of these cases, if domestic courts can't or won't pursue justice, and we oppose the ICC, where do we think victims are supposed to go for justice? And what justice mechanisms do you support for them?
Thank you. First, let me just say at the outset that it is impossible not to be profoundly moved by not just the loss of life in the recent violence and conflict, but especially the children whose lives were lost. And we all have a tendency to throw statistics and numbers out there, but we were talking about boys and girls, Israelis and Palestinians, as well as men and women. And I think none of us, from whatever perspective we come, can lose sight of that. So that's one thing that's very important. Look, you know our views on the ICC and its jurisdiction. We continue to believe that absent a Security Council referral or absent the request by the state itself, that's not appropriate. I continue to believe that whether it is the United States or Israel, both of us have the means.
Mr. Secretary, I do understand that point. I'm asking what mechanisms you think is available to them.
I believe that we have, whether it's the United States or Israel, we both have the mechanisms to make sure that there is accountability in any situations where there are concerns about the use of force and human rights, et cetera. I believe that both of our democracies have that capacity, and we've demonstrated it, and we'll need to continue to demonstrate it going forward.
And in the case of Afghanistan?
With regard to Afghanistan, if it's our objection, as you know, was to the assertion of jurisdiction over the United States in the absence of a Security Council referral. And I believe that we have the means, if there are any cases to be brought, to adjudicate them and to find justice.
Now, you might be asking, what do Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's comments drawing moral equivalence between the U.S. and Israel on the one hand and genocidal jihadist terrorists and American troop murderers on the other have to do with the Biden administration? Well, the fact of the matter is that while they may differ in terms of rhetoric and in policy specifics, directionally they are aligned. They are the same. And that all of a dozen Democrats or so came out to condemn Congresswoman Omar reflects what I wrote in the book over my shoulder right here, American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar and the Progressive Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party, that her party had caved to its radical leftists, and that this was reflected when they closed ranks from the leadership on down regarding her blatant past anti-Semitism. Moreover, I argued that anti-Semitism was a proxy for general animus towards the West, towards liberty and justice, towards our founders, and towards you and me. A couple of weeks back, the Biden administration declared the rise in anti-Semitism in America that we've seen in recent weeks despicable and unconscionable. He hasn't yet said anything about the anti-Semite Congresswoman Omar, who sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and who arguably legitimizes these sorts of positions, the kinds of rhetoric that the left would say incites this sort of violence. Yet just days earlier, when faced with attacks from genocidal anti-Semites, Joe Biden told the world's sole Jewish state to stand down in the face of them. In fact, the Biden administration pledged millions of dollars to the Palestinian Arabs, almost guaranteed to pay for the genocidal anti-Semites' next wave of terror. Like other Democrat leaders, Biden remained mum as colleagues, Congresswoman Omar's squad mates, recited Hamas talking points, slandering the only free, liberal, and pluralistic democracy in the Middle East. 500 Democrat staffers and 2020 Biden campaign alumni urged him to quote-unquote hold Israel accountable, not to hold accountable the genocidal anti-Semites attacking her. Jews historically have served as a canary in the coal mine for Western civilization. When Jew hatred rises, tyranny lurks, and that the Jewish state is under assault after 40 years of relative quiet, and American Jews, too, have found themselves increasingly under assault here, tells us something has shifted. America is back, the White House likes to tell us. But back to what? Empowering the haters of the little Satan, Israel, and great Satan, America, under the banner of justice. Back, in other words, to the Obama agenda that blew up the Middle East the first time, and with the same Obamaites who lit the matches. Their view is simple. They believe, insanely, that America's national interest is served by rewarding enemies and punishing friends, and that lying through their teeth to achieve their agenda is perfectly acceptable. Just ask Ben Rhodes, the Obama administration mouthpiece who bragged about creating an echo chamber that manipulated an ignorant and adoring media to help the administration ram through its disastrous Iran policy. The Obamaites, and now the Bidenites, believe in applying equity to foreign policy, righting the wrongs of racism, colonialism, and imperialism with the blood of our allies, partners, and ultimately Americans. So you see, this is just the domestic counterpart to, say, imposing critical race theory in our schools. Sorry, this is the international counterpart to that domestic policy. That 4 months into year one of the Biden administration, Iran is enriching uranium to nearly nuclear bomb grade. Iran-backed Hamas has launched more than 4,000 rockets at Israel. And half a world away, again, here in America, Jews are under attack from New York to Los Angeles, is a testament to the fact the agenda is working. To understand how colossal a disaster this all is, remember the situation that Joe Biden inherited from Donald Trump. Tehran's tyrannical malocracy was tottering under the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. The leader of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps had been taken out. That crippling blow sent a message. America had no desire to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But if monsters were to strike at us, we would strike back infinitely harder, as a warning to other monsters not to dare test us. America helped foster historic peace agreements between Israel and Sunni Arab nations that in the past would have been content to see it wiped off the earth. There was promise of still greater peace accords to come, including perhaps one with the seat of the Sunni world, Saudi Arabia. It's almost an afterthought today, but ISIS wasn't just degraded, it was swiftly crushed. And it's even less spoken of that over the last 4 years, jihadist attacks in America essentially came to a halt. I don't believe that was a coincidence, and I don't think you do either. With an ailing Iran, a robust U.S.-Israel Arab counterweight to it, and weakened jihadists Sunni and Shia, no new American military engagements, and existing ones winding down, Joe Biden could not have been gifted a better hand in the Middle East. Relative peace in the Middle East, and a smaller role for America, less blood and treasure to be spilled there, while we turn to the far greater problems over the horizon, namely including communist China. Joe Biden has decided to fold the royal flush that he was handed, cough up his chips, and douse the geopolitical poker table with gasoline. We are going to get burned. The Biden administration's response to the recent attacks on Israel is a microcosm of its efforts since day one to utterly wreck what it inherited. When Israel, our greatest ally in the Middle East, the first line of defense against Islamist tyranny, a pivotal military, technological, and economic partner with shared values, principles, and history, found itself under attack from Iran-backed Hamas and other forces of jihadist darkness, America didn't stand in solidarity with her under President Biden. It bullied her. According to reports, the administration demanded that Israel give terrorists a veto over Israeli law and sovereignty. It demanded that Israel stand down while its people were attacked at their holiest site, the Temple Mount. And it demanded that Israel not celebrate a national holiday commemorating the liberation of its biblical, historical, spiritual, and legal capital, Jerusalem. Can you imagine for a second Joe Biden demanding these things of any other regime in the world, of any other government in the world, of China's Xi Jinping, Russia's Vladimir Putin, or North Korea's Kim Jong-un? And give me a break. While the administration in effect told Israel not to fully defend itself, of course it rewarded Israel's aggressors. After the ceasefire, the Biden administration engaged in pay to slay. It offered $100 million to the Palestinian Arabs. But who was actually offering that money to were the likes of President Mahmoud Abbas, currently in the 16th year of his 4-year term, and the tyrannical regime that he oversees also will benefit from it. The money will end up in the hands of terrorists of Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, most likely. And of course, the corrupted and Jew-hating United Nations Relief and Works Agency will also be ones collecting this money. You know, collectively, these are the people who give pensions to the families of suicide bombers, use kids as human shields, propagandize on behalf of terrorist groups, and hide weapons in mosques. The Biden administration even admits its Gaza funds will probably fund terror. The administration further rewarded the terrorists by vowing to open a Palestinian Arab diplomatic mission in Jerusalem, which means 2 missions in Jerusalem, undermining the status of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Joe Biden, in other words, arguably lied about recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and may be breaking the Jerusalem Embassy Act, federal law. Earlier in his presidency, he had reopened the Palestine Liberation Organization's mission in Washington and rejoined the UN Anti-Human Rights Commission. At least that's what it should be called. The Trump administration had closed the former when the PLO refused to engage in peace talks with Israel and left the latter, the Anti-Human Rights Commission, because of its anti-Semitism and related acts. With this background, it's little wonder that Palestinian Arabs felt free to attack Israel, and with weapons from Iran that may well have been bought with funds from us. Funds that flowed into Tehran's coffers from the Obama-Biden-Iran nuclear deal. Speaking of Iran, with its regime openly enriching uranium at levels well beyond the nuclear caps, with its proxies allegedly attacking American servicemen, some 300 plus attacks reported in over the last year, and with the Iran-backed Houthis stepping up their attacks on partner Saudi Arabia after the Biden administration took office, again, probably not as a coincidence, what has the Biden administration done in response? Well, it asked Iran to come to the negotiating table without preconditions. It withdrew snapped-back UN sanctions that had brought Iran's malacracy to its knees. It revoked the Houthis' foreign terror designation precisely at the time it was ramping up that terror. In other words, the Biden administration bent over backwards for America's greatest adversary in the region and one of the top adversaries in the world. And just as the Biden administration undermined anti-Iran bulwark Israel, it also sniped at Iran's Arab foes and our partners and allies in certain instances. The Biden administration needlessly released an intelligence assessment containing nothing new about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's alleged calling of the hit on Jamal Khashoggi, imposing sanctions on 76 Saudi officials, seemingly as part of a stated effort to recalibrate the relationship. It also froze arms sales to the Saudis. It did the same to the United Arab Emirates, removing a key plank in the Abraham Accords. We now find out that the Biden administration, it appears as a policy, refuses to call the Abraham Accords by name. That it has, according to the Washington Free Beacon, erased the name from a wide array of official State Department communications as the new administration presses officials to refer to the Trump-era deals as normalization agreements. The signal the Biden administration has given to all of America's enemies is very clear. It may talk about standing with allies, but it will happily pay their genocidal adversaries. It may talk about standing up for human rights, but it will coddle the worst violators. In a Middle East where what matters most is strength, allies and partners are going to increasingly hedge their bets by leaning towards China, undermining our national interests. The region will grow increasingly volatile, with Iran and Islamist groups of all kinds emboldened by the return of Obamaism, undermining our allies and partners, and likely ultimately threatening America. So you see, this is about way more than Israel or just the Middle East. At its core, it's about America versus its adversaries. Our adversaries will seize upon the administration's folly and weakness and exploit it. In recent days, we've seen a lot of political theater that is worth hammering, and maybe we will in a future episode. Joe Biden tweeting an image of herself preparing for the G7 meetings, even though no one elected her president, just like Edith Wilson reincarnated. Dr. Anthony Fauci crying that you're anti-science if you dare to criticize him, because he is science personified. Boy, it doesn't get much more scientific than that, refusing any and all dissent. Joe Biden calling global warming the greatest threat, according to the Joint Chiefs, which, if that's really what our Joint Chiefs think, God help us. But also, if that's what our Commander-in-Chief thinks, God help us. I guess Joe Biden has now moved away from white supremacy being the number one threat after his son's texts were exposed, and even as the press covered it up. And then we also saw, of course, the collapse of yet another narrative about how Trump had tear-gassed protesters in Lafayette Square for a photo op. That narrative was completely obliterated, like almost every single hysterical narrative the media has put forth for the last 4+ years. But step back from all of that political theater for a second and look with clear eyes at the overall Biden agenda. It's quite simple to summarize it. It's about empowering anti-American ideologues at home and our anti-American adversaries abroad, and conceding to their shared narrative that we are an irredeemable and deplorable bastion, and that, in effect, we deserve to see the traditional American system destroyed in some kind of revolution. Bob Gates was right about Joe Biden being wrong on every major foreign policy issue, but now we're all going to suffer it. With that, be well, America.